Welcome to another edition of Snap Hot Takes, where I seriously engage with all of the ridiculous things people say on social media. Series drops are not the answer. I basically agree with this. People put a lot on series drops because I think they're the only actual event in Marvel Snap where the game ever gets any cheaper. And so that results in people sort of displacing all of their dissatisfaction with the entire system and saying that series drops are not enough to make the entire system good. And I think that is basically 100% true. Every time series drops come around, people expect a ton out of them because they are the only time where things ever have a chance to get better. And so that creates unrealistic expectations on series drops, but more than that, it really does go to show that series drops can't solve the underlying issues. The only real way that they could have series drops that people would be happy with would be if they dropped an equivalent amount of cards as they released. They have never done that, and they have never demonstrated a willingness to even do that. I do not think that that will ever be a thing that is happening, which tells me that the problem is more about underlying issues than it is about, oh, they're not dropping enough. Because them not dropping enough, I will say they probably have a reason for it, and that reason is probably monetization related. And if they can't hit their whatever like KPIs with the ability to drop all of the stuff that they need to drop in order to make the community happy, it does speak to a lack of cohesiveness between what they envision the game being and what the community envisions the game being. And so I say series drops aren't the answer in the sense that I think they probably need to do a larger rework of the game's economy, because as is, all that is happening is series 4 and 5 are growing and growing and growing, and series drops are curtailing it a bit, but there's no actual movement downward in terms of the size of series 4 and 5. All we've seen is sort of infinite growth in that space, and I think that is something that people are reacting to. I got a lot of like critiques for sort of comparing it to inflation, but it's fairly similar, if like far less serious, because the things you can spend money on, there are more and more and more of them. Your dollar is going less far. Each Series 5 card you pick up is now a smaller percentage of Series 5, and there's no real examination of that or evidence that it's ever going to stop. And I think that is why series drops are ultimately not the answer. The only way they could be the answer is if Second Dinner were willing to drop as many cards as they released in the time period since the previous series drops. An entire community crying about card acquisition in a game literally advertised in the beginning is, what if you couldn't just jump into a new game and buy all the cards? So the issue with that is that now people have been playing this game for a while, and it turns out that what if you can't just jump into the game and buy all the new cards is a recipe for getting run over by the people who are entrenched in the system. And I think one of the biggest issues Marvel Snap has as a game is that there is massive first mover advantage. When you look at the biggest streamers in Marvel Snap, the biggest content creators, it's all people who were all here at the beginning. People who were able to make their investments at the beginning and have every card at the beginning, which allows them to only pick up the new card, and then they have everything and they can make content about it, right? Imagine being a new player and you want to be like, oh, I want to be like Cozy Snap. You can't. You can't do that. Like, you actually just can't do it. And so this creates a cycle of people such that when a highly invested player leaves, there's no real route for them to be replaced with another highly invested player, because that second highly invested player has to build up to that status over the course of like a year. And so you have all these weird symptoms of that, like the way MMR works, putting Series 1 gamers near the top of Infinite. That's just a ridiculous thing to ever happen, right? There's a bunch of stuff that happens where it's like, okay, for every, highly invested player we lose, we'll pick up other players, but they won't become highly invested players for like a year. And that really impacts your content ecosystem too, because as much as people think that like they don't care about content, this is a game that does Twitch drops every month. They care about those numbers. And I think that it does matter when the only people who are allowed to make content are basically the same clique of people who have been doing it the entire time. And I think that is really unpleasant, honestly. Even though I'm one of those people, I'm part of that clique. Like, I've been here since the beta. I have all the cards. And part of why I try to go out of my way to, like, put my platform on, like, my friends who started later than me, like competitive players along those lines, is because without that leg up, I feel like it's actually pretty hard to break out. And I think that that is a problem, weirdly, that is entirely down to you can't just join the game and play at the highest level. Like in Magic the Gathering, you could go spend $100 and you could have a standard deck. You can't do that here. There's no amount of money you could even spend that would allow you to have a tier 1 deck tomorrow if you just started the game. And that feels a little ridiculous to me. Now that Hellcow's been nerfed, Hela could use a buff. The card is all but dead now and hasn't been seen in weeks. My take on this is good. I don't think Hela has ever made any metagame environment more enjoyable or better. The nicest thing I can say about Hela is that she was very often a cheap budget alternative, and I do think that matters, and that is important that there is a cheap, good budget alternative deck. I firmly believe that, and I do think that the game has sort of been trending away from that, and I don't like that. However, that deck being Hela is doing a disservice, not just to the budget players, but to everybody. Hela is a deck that is very much a point ceiling deck. It says you must be this tall to ride. If you are playing anything smaller than me, I am going to run you over. There are not very profitable ways of interacting with it, although this, we have Fenris Wolf now. Maybe it actually is more fine to bring Hela back. We'll see. Hela back, girl. And I do think that it is potentially the kind of deck that you don't want being one of your best decks because of the limited ways of interacting with it and the binary nature of it. People talk about the RNG of Hela. That's not actually the problem. The problem is that it is such a yes or no deck that has no actual play to it. You just do your stuff, and if it's big enough, you win, and if it's not big enough, you lose. And that's it. And that is not a fun play style. And if I were picking a deck to give to, like, quote unquote budget players, I would want them to have something that, represents the good stuff about Marvel Snap, jockeying for board position, fun to play, stuff like that. Hela isn't that. And so I think it's doing a disservice, not just to everybody to have a deck like that in the metagame, but also to the people who are benefiting from it. I mean, I'd rather they have it than not have it. If you're going to be like a mostly Series 3 gamer, I'd rather you have a good deck. But I do think that ultimately it's the play pattern of Hela that is frustrating and obnoxious, and that just like yes, no binary kind of play pattern where you're not really making any decisions even. It's like if bounce required no thought process behind it. And I think that's generally a bad thing. I do think it's a good thing that there are cheap decks in Marvel Snap, and I would like more of them. Snap repeating characters makes the game less interesting. Why bring in Rocket and Groot from Rivals of all people? We're getting Sam Wilson again. There are so many cool characters and effects that are taken up by things like Thaddeus Ross. I admit Thaddeus Ross probably kind of a ridiculous character to actually make, but I'm assuming that's a tie-in with the new Captain America movie. We're getting Sam Wilson again because the new Captain America movie. And I think that actually makes a ton of sense, unfortunately. I personally think that, like, people identify with certain characters, and because of the way Marvel Snap sort of did those characters at the beginning of the game, because we have vanilla Cyclops at 3-4, vanilla Hulk at 6-12, there are going to be people who are like, damn, why does my favorite character suck? And going back and doing other versions of that character might actually help those people get invested in the game, because when you actually get down to it, right, like, when you look at what popular characters are, and I think like the Spider People is a great example of this. You have, if you're a Spider-Man fan, you have not just normal Spider-Man, but you also have symbiote Spider-Man. You have Miles Morales. You have Gwen. You have all of these different cards that are like they're all spider people, but they're not. And like specifically for Peter Parker, there's symbiote Spider-Man and there's 3-5 normal Spider-Man, right? Like, I think that's probably good because there are certain characters in Marvel that are way more popular than other characters in Marvel. And I think generally, if you're selling a product, you want to give the people what they want. And bluntly, I think we've seen that the people want Spider-Man, the people want, Captain America, the people want like the popular guys. They want those guys. That matters, right? And I think, Thaddeus Ross, it's like, all right, maybe you don't need 2 Thaddeus Rosses in the game. That's not a really popular card. But I think that's just kind of them getting caught off guard by Captain America New World Order. Like, they made Red Hulk, and then they were like, it'll be fine. And then Captain America New World Order trailers drop, and suddenly you got to make a card for Harrison Ford. And it's like, all right, I get it. You got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, right? I don't think they should do multiple Thaddeus Rosses, but like 2 Sam Wilsons, the guy who specifically goes from being Falcon to being Captain America, that being his arc, should probably have a Falcon and a Captain America card. The Spider-Man stuff where he goes from being normal Spider-Man to the symbiote Spider-Man, he should probably have 2 cards for that. I actually do believe that. I think it probably is good. Matchmaking is predatory. Card pulls and board locations grow increasingly worse as you climb ladder. Anyone not going through this are too low ranked and or play low ranked cards. I hope you hear me when I say this as someone who is not low ranked and does not play low ranked cards. As a very high ranked gamer who plays very good cards, you are coping. This is cope. This is how you deal with the fact that you have not progressed to the extent that you would like. This is your entitlement on display. Matchmaking is not rigged. It just is not. And people in every card game, I remember a thread with 1,000 posts in it talking about the rigging of the MTG Arena Shuffler. It's just not real. It just is not real. There is no upside to rigging matchmaking in this way, and it would actually be very difficult. People like to talk about counter cards as if they are magical, and like matchups as if they are 100-0. And I think anyone good enough at card games would recognize that there's no such thing as a 100-0 matchup, and even if you're playing a deck with a bunch of ongoings in it, that doesn't mean you're always losing to the card Enchantress. And I think that this persistent belief across games that it would be beneficial to the company to rig matchmaking against you comes from a lack of understanding of the natural ways in which that occurs anyway. And by that I mean MMR. Matchmaking is rigged by MMR, which is matching you up against opponents who are as good as you are. That's how they rig it. Like, they match you up against people as good as you are, and so the higher you get, the more likely you are to plateau at that 50% win rate that they want you to be at. I think a lot of the time when I say stuff like this, people are like, of course there's an incentive for them to rig it. They want you to be at a 50% win rate. And they do, but they want that over a large period of time. They want you to have whatever representative, like, it doesn't matter if you like win 10 and lose 10. That doesn't matter. What matters is that it averages out to something like that. And I think actually another way in which you could call matchmaking rigged is the higher up you get, the less you get for wins and the more you lose for losses. Whenever I play Marvel Snap, I gain about 6 SP for a 2-cuber, and I lose about 8 for a 2-cuber. That ratio pretty much persists. I gain about 24 SP for an 8-cuber, and I lose about 32 SP for an 8-cuber. What that means is I need to be going cube positive by a ratio of about like 1.2 or 1.3 to 1. And if I don't do that, I'm losing SP on the session, even if I'm going like 1.1 to 1, even if I'm going positive. I've had long sessions where I played for 6 hours, 8 hours, where I'm going positive, but losing SP, because that's how that can happen. And I think ultimately a lot of people look at things like this and they say it must be rigged in a very obvious and overt way where it's actually rigged. And the point I'm trying to make is they have no need to actually do that. It would be extraneous work for no reason, because the goal that you perceive them as trying to accomplish, pushing you to a 50% win rate, that happens naturally with MMR. That's just how things work. And the way MMR works, pushing you downwards, in the sense of like you're always going to be getting to the level you're supposed to be at over a large enough sample size, that'll put most people at that 50% win rate anyway. That's what plateauing is. That's what MMR does. And when you get too high, like I and many other people at the very top end of Infinite, it tries to even drag you further down by giving you uneven win and loss matchups because most people are ranked so far below you that it can't reward you for beating them the same way it would for punishing you to lose to them. And I think whenever people talk about direct rigging, like, oh, they're matching me up into counters. There's no reason for them to do that because it already happens naturally because that's how MMR works. And ultimately, I think that this is representative not only of not understanding like just, basic stuff about MMR and card games, but also like it's almost always someone saying they're matching me up into counters. And, what if you're the counter getting matched up into somebody else? It's never evenly rigged. It's always rigged against you personally. And I just don't think that whenever you sort of game this stuff out, it just never makes sense to actually do it. It never makes sense to actually build a system that does this as opposed to just like putting MMR in it, which works for literally every other card game. The Marvel Snap card acquisition is held hostage by the existence of art for niche characters. I think this might actually be true, because in order for them to get spotlights into the game, they need to acquire the rights for various pieces of art to use on spotlight caches. I kind of wonder about this. Like, if I could get someone on record at Second Dinner, would they be, like, willing to talk about, like, whether or not getting the art for a spotlight variant is a meaningful limiter on how often they can repeat stuff? Like, I think we've all noticed that there were certain cards they tended to repeat a decent amount, and I'm kind of wondering if that was down to the fact that they were easy to get art for. I really wonder if that's, like, a real thing, because, like, we often see people complaining, like, this variant isn't worth being in a spotlight, and I wonder if that's the wrong thing to complain about. I think we should try to say, like, maybe we should lower our standards for what a spotlight variant is, and we might get more good stuff in them. Hydra Bob is a frustratingly strong card, largely because he feels too strong not to pick up for high-level play, yet too generic or boring to want to experiment with. Boring generic staples being Series 5 due to power level is frustrating. I used to feel this way about Jeff, now it's Hydra Bob. Yeah, Hydra Bob is a card I hate people asking me about, because he is objectively right now a card that is worth picking up, but he's also such an outlier at the 1 power spot, and the reasoning they gave for that Silver Sable nerf feels like it applies directly to Hydra Bob. And so it's like, I don't want to be the person who recommended you buy Hydra Bob based on right now, and then he gets nerfed in 2 weeks, and I feel like a jackass. I think that's ultimately the problem with, well, one of the problems, I should say, with how Marvel Snap works, is like, anything that is enough of an outlier gets nerfed. And so if you're picking up on something, like, imagine, like, a sine curve where, like, this is where you're investing. If you're investing, like, after people already realize the thing is good, you're risking, like, a big downside if the development or the design team or the balance team also thinks that card is too good. And so a lot of the time, people that watch me, they're looking for me to say, this card is busted, go pick it up. But by the time everyone recognizes that it's busted, then it might be on the watch list. And I think Hydra Bob is a great example of this, where it's just like, geez, I do not know if he can stay. And I think Jeff's actually kind of a bad example of this, because Jeff, it felt like, was never in danger of being nerfed, if only because nerfing him would do so much damage to the card. Like, there wasn't really a good nerf available to him. You take him to 2/2, he's probably ass. Whereas with Hydra Bob, it's like, if you take that card to 1/4, that would work. Like, that would be a functional nerf. And I think that is the thing that worries me about Hydra Bob specifically, is like, he sticks out so strongly among 1s in a way that Jeff never stuck out among 2s in terms of the numbers on the card. Jeff stuck out among 2s in terms of play rate, win rate, all that stuff. But just the literal numbers on the card on Hydra Bob stick out so strongly among 1s at this point that it does really start to worry me when we start talking about potential changes. I will say, I do think Hydra Bob is in many cases an eminently budgetable card. In most sort of like Malekith anti-venom decks, you can just replace him with Killmonger, and then you won't have any one drops, and you'll just be able to use a Killmonger effectively. In other decks, like Moon Girl, for example, you can replace him with Ant-Man. In various sort of like mid-rangey pixie decks, you can usually replace him with like an Iceman or a Spider-Ham, and it won't be a direct replacement, but you can do it. He's a fairly budgetable card, but there's no one-to-one replacement. And that's another frustrating thing about him. A lot of people are pointing at Steam numbers and Twitch views as proof that Snap is dying. Are people upset? Yes. Is it a number SD is concerned about? Probably not. I'd be surprised if every player on social media was even 10% of the player base. It's mostly a casual audience. I think I disagree with this, but I think, first of all, I'll just put this out on Front Street. A lot of people ask me if I'm worried about Marvel Snap dying. I am not worried about Marvel Snap ever dying. I think this game is starting from a place of very, very high success and has such a small team working on it relatively that I find it hard to believe it could ever be unprofitable. I do worry about my ability to be a Marvel Snap content creator dying. That's the kind of thing that's at risk here. Like when you look at stuff like when you look at other games of this nature, I think the floor here is high enough that Marvel Snap is never going to die the way people are talking about it. But when you look at the content ecosystem, you see a lot of people in my situation who are similarly worried about their ability to continue doing this job. And I think saying that Second Dinner doesn't care about that is wrong. Again, this company does Twitch drops every month. They have a system of content where it is set up such that it is easy to make content on the game. One new card every week. It's an easy content factory kind of game. I think that they do care. And I think that they would be worried hearing me say that I am worried about my ability to continue making content for this game long term and to have that be profitable. That worries me. And I think it probably worries them as well. I think it worries them that a lot of their biggest streamers aren't really streaming the game anymore. I think that is a problem they're worried about. I think it worries them that Pokemon Pocket and Marvel Rivals dropping at the same time as they're having massive economy problems. I think that worries them. I think their social presence does worry them. And I think it probably should. Like, it's not the world's most important indicator, but I do think it matters. Activate is a good start, but Snap should introduce many more keywords. I agree with this. I think Snap needs to expand its design space. Ultimately, it is a card game with two numbers on the cards. And so I think one of the things we see a lot is like them doing a lot of like afflict type stuff in an attempt to add a third number onto the card. One of the things I would pay attention to if you were like a fan of design is looking at how many cards effectively have a third number added to them in their text box. I think that's like a little cool way of like adding some depth to a fundamentally fairly shallow design pool. I do think more keywords would help, but I also think it's hard to come up with keywords. When you look at something like Activate, that's a fine-ish keyword. I don't see anything wrong with that as a keyword, but it's also like a keyword that by definition is going to be a B at best compared to the A that is on reveal or ongoing, because you can only use it if you play the card on 5 out of the 6 turns of the game, which means 83%, meaning it can't ever be an A. Like, an ongoing card is useful on all 6 turns. An on-reveal card is useful on all 6 turns. An Activate card is useful on 83% of turns. That's a difference. That matters. And I find it hard to come up with other A mechanics that are useful on all 6 turns of the game because of the relative shallowness of the design space. So I think this is true, but just harder to do than you might think. Why High Voltage seems amazing is just because people haven't figured out the best deck for it, and it'll become stale once some decks are much better than the others. True, and that's why it should only last a week, and that's why only lasting a week is a good thing. I think people look down on novelty too much. Sometimes you just want to do something new. Sometimes having something new that is just new and interesting to explore, but is similar enough to the game you already love and enjoy, that can give you new perspectives and new abilities to do cool stuff that you wouldn't normally be able to do, that's just good. The game mode doesn't have to stand on its own. It's not Hearthstone Battlegrounds. It's Tavern Brawl. And it's just got to be a fun little tavern brawl. And I think that is something that people do want. They want like just a little tavern brawl. Something that is similar but different, gives them something to do, has a different experience to it, and they can avoid getting like shit kicked by Arashem or whatever. And yes, if we had months to figure out the meta in high voltage, yeah, it would be bad. But we don't, and that's by design, and that's smart. Their comical release videos are old and hurt the problems in Snap more than build hype. More effort is spent into some time with stupid jokes than actually addressing things. I think this is making like a pretty common mistake where it's like, they should stop being funny on social media and start fixing the problems with the game. And it's like, I don't really think that the game problems get fixed any quicker if they stop posting. I don't think those are taking from the same pool of talent here. You're not seeing the guys in charge of monetization in those videos. You're not seeing a lot of the dev team in those videos. You're seeing Ben Brode making some jokes. And I don't really think that the idea that Ben Brode spends half a day filming a video is gonna take away from like the monetization problem time solving. It's not like the rest of the time Ben Brode is hard at work dreaming up Spotlight Cash 2, you know? That's not really how this works in any meaningful way. And I think that, you know, I think this is sort of like identifying two things that you don't like and then assuming them to be related. I strongly doubt that any of the videos they make have any relevance whatsoever, positive or negative, to time spent on, like, fixing monetization. It just doesn't seem like a realistic thing to me. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching that video. As always, I hope you enjoyed the hot takes, and I have one of my own at the end here, or less a hot take and more of a question that I want you guys to answer. I personally believe that most of, if not, 99% of discontent with Marvel Snap is about the economy. I have heard from some very enfranchised players that to them it's actually more about like Arashem or like the meta being bad. What do you think? Do you think people are more mad at the economy or the metagame in Marvel Snap? Me personally, I think it's the economy by a lot. Thanks for watching.